Good evening, I'm Brandon Ranchis, the senior curator here at the Missoula Art Museum. Well, not here at the Missoula Art Museum. These are not shows that we've curated. We're really grateful to be at the Public House tonight to bring this lecture of Lucy Lippard. We wanted to be able to spread out. If you've been to the museum recently, you've seen how busy the exhibitions are, and almost every gallery is full. We have lots of three-dimensional shows on view right now, so we thought, what's the next best thing to having a lecture at the Missoula Art Museum? And this adjacent space has been very flexible and very good, so we thought we'd move over here. So thank you for finding us, and thank you for following us over here. I appreciate it. I wanted to thank MCAT tonight for recording this lecture. Are the levels good? Everybody in the back can hear? That's really great. I'm glad that we've got such great sound tonight. Well, celebrated for her deeply influential work as an author, a critic, and a curator, Lucy Lippard is recognized as one of contemporary art's most significant scholars, and that's why we're here. She's consistently independent and innovative in her thinking, being among the first to recognize some of the concepts such as dematerialization in conceptual art, and being an early champion of feminist art, producing groundbreaking exhibitions as a curator, and really championing certain art forms and artists over the years. She began her writing career in 1962 at the ripe old age of 25, which I find is just incredible, and she's been hard at work at it for the last 55 years, producing fresh ideas on an annual basis and bringing them to the public in many different forms. Over the course of her career, she helped found the Art Workers Coalition, an art activist lobbying group, Printed Matter, the nonprofit dedicated to artist books and publications by artists, and as well as the feminist journal Heresies. She's also done over 24 publications, which is really significant. They've ranged in topic and in tone. Some of them have been changing, essays in art criticism, as well as the one that we're going to hear tonight, a presentation on tonight, Undermining, her most recent. I'm sorry to say, if you haven't received a copy of the book, we're sold out. So we anticipated a strong run on the publication and had extras at MAM preceding the lecture, but we had a wonderful book club hosted by Whitney Ford Terry, as well as some other things, and we've been able to sell them. This is part of a whole series that we've envisioned. Our first speaker was Glenn Adamson, and we're trying to do Voices in Contemporary Art lecture series, combining a book club and a lecture series together so that you can read the ideas, you can immerse yourself in these authors' thinking, and then get to hear about that author or from that author, which is really kind of a fun approach. So Lucy is a longtime friend of the Missoula Art Museum. This is not the first time that she has spoken in Missoula. If you were lucky enough to hear her last time, I'm glad you came back for more. We're really pleased to welcome her back. She's consistently been inquisitive about what we do at MAM, what our exhibitions are. You'd think that somebody with a schedule like hers, that's as busy as hers, she wouldn't ask the details, like which artists are you showing right now? What's up in the galleries? What are the shows that really matter? And those were the questions that impressed me immediately. So if you could silence your cell phones, and please join me in welcoming Lucy Lippard.
Hi. If we get the tech going, do I just poke it and then?
John, poke it.
I'll poke it. Can you see that with the light? It's
The skylights, yeah.
Anyway, I want to begin by thanking the Native Nations on whose lands we meet tonight, the Salish Kootenai, Pend Oreille, and Blackfeet. They are very washed out. There isn't any way of, no, okay, I won't complain. So 16 years ago, I was asked to speak at a symposium in London on the global city, which really didn't interest me much because I live in a tiny rural village in northern New Mexico, which you see a picture of there. So inspired by a recent conversation at that point with a local earth mover who's also an artist, I thought I'd undermine that invitation and talk about gravel pits, a verbal visual riff on cities and their origins, pits and erections, extraction, innate of erection. I've got to learn to do this, sorry about the interruptions. That should be. The antithesis of the city, the classic erection, is its birthplace, the pit. And I think this city may have been, did we skip the city? No, it was, there it is. That was the city. This is the pit. This is a photograph by Peter Goen. It's the Liberty Pit in Ruth, Nevada. And you're welcome to read in some feminist innuendos here. Soon after that, September 11th happened, a startling reversal, towers to pits, that and the ongoing destruction of the landscape and cultural resources in the West provided the brackets for the Undermining project and this small book. Whoops, why is this doing this? Let's see. Am I poking something wrong? There, whoops, why does it jump? Oops, sorry.
Might be double poking.
And we'll run through this again. City, pit, book. Okay, and see what the next one is supposed to be. Yes. I always get the title. Anyway, this book was published 3-4 years ago, actually now. The only reason I'm still lecturing on it is that it's so easy to update. It becomes a different talk in each venue, and I never run out of cliffhangers. I always get the title of the book first before writing, so it's Undermining, literally, as in pits and shafts. And more specifically, the gravel pit is a stand-in for the bottom level of the 21st century landscape, what cultural geographer J.B. Jackson called the subterranean economy, what we know best as the extraction industry. And finally, undermining as a political act, as in subversion and subtext. Undermining is what we're doing to our continent and to our planet. I'm concerned with mining as land use and as metaphor, but the book is also about nuclear testing, archaeology, adobe building, alternative energy, photography, tourism, land art, Native American sacred sites, activism, climate change, and the kitchen sink. Literally, since water plays a huge part in anything out here. Don't worry, I can't cover all these subjects tonight. We'd be here till morning. My methodology is simple and experiential. One thing leads to another. And I reminded myself in writing this talk it was for an art audience. It's a long introduction, but I want you to know what you're in for. This is by Tom Greyeyes, who's Diné, Navajo. It's called Angel. It's out in the middle of Navajo land. Actually, I think it's in Apache land. Bunch of plastic bottles, the angel of water being wasted. I've always been attracted to the collage aesthetic, the way Dada and Surrealism explored the unknown by juxtaposing two unlike images to form a new reality. And of course, collage is also a staple of feminist art, and collaboration is its social form. So this book was an experiment, sort of an extended essay with parallel verbal and visual narratives, modeled on the artist books that I've worked with since we founded Printed Matter decades ago. This collage is fittingly built on gravel and cement, aggregates often formed by water. What I call real gravel, naturally created pebbles, is geological debris, constructive disintegration, alluvial, waterborne, from old streams and lake beds. Unreal gravel is fake, just crushed rock, produced by dynamite and hard rock mining, socially and ecologically destructive processes. Scarce water can be used to separate it from its mother lode. Groundwater is polluted in the process. Erosion flourishes. I'm into dirt and digging. My last two books were about archaeology and the history of Pueblo Indians in the Southwest, who incidentally farmed with gravel mulch to preserve heat and water. Personally, my gravel pit obsession offers me a dialectical take on the relationship between my 35 years in the New York City avant-garde and almost 25 years in rural New Mexico. The interface is crucial. It's another collage. I've been riding the roads between local and global, rural and metropolitan. I'm trying to see what art I can bring with me, what will fit in my baggage. This is a gravel pit owned by the artist Nancy Holt, who did Sun Tunnels, which you'll see in a second. And this is the pit from which she made the piece. Gravel pits transform the geological past into dubious futures and are crucial to the production of modern spaces in the landscapes of Western states. The emptiness of the pit suggests a similar alienation of land and culture when nature is perceived as resource only. Out on the margins, where local scars cover for global perpetrators, we live in a kind of mirror, where negative space here is more important than what's constructed from its deported materials there. I became obsessed with gravel when my earth mover friend reproved me for griping about gravel mines as blights on the local landscape. He said more or less, hell, you've used gravel for your road. Everybody wants gravel. They just don't want gravel mines. If you're going to tackle gravel, go for the multinationals, not the locals. That's my road. Apparently, Lafarge, a global gravel mining corporation, was taking over the American West at the time, putting the locals out of business. I'm told that aggregates are the largest mining industry in the US. This was kind of a surprise. I naively considered gravel pits, when I considered them at all, as the epitome of local enterprise. You know, you have some otherwise unproductive land and a pickup, you need money, you go for it. So maybe it used to be like that, but global takeovers are something else. Scale is a big issue here, visually and economically. Gravel pits aren't always eyesores. In arid western lands, the great panoramas are already gravel pits. Nature made some and humans made others, and some of those humans are artists. Earthworks artists were inspired by and envied the scale of the vast pits made in the earth by Anaconda, Kennecott, and other global giants, which you know well in Montana, as well as the great monumental civilizations of the past, whose borrow pits have long since become part of the topography. This is Double Negative by Michael Heiser. Heiser created his own pits like Double Negative and erections like City Complex, which is 1 mile long and 500 feet high in the long-suffering state of Nevada, where his archaeologist father analyzed native petroglyphs in the Great Basin. This will virtually replace a nearby mountain being removed by Anaconda, which donated the earth piecemeal to the artist for his monument. And it's going to be visible primarily from 20,000 feet above, but it's also recently been included in a national monument to be protected for the ages. We'll see what Zinke does to that. This is Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels in Utah. In the 1960s and early 70s, I was really enthused, as were so many of us, about earthworks, now known as land art. They were among the many escape attempts of the time, ways to get out of or beyond the city and the art world's institutionalized trajectory. I always loved being outdoors, and here was art coming out to meet me. Since the mid-1990s, however, I've written about land art in the rearview mirror, because it's been replaced in my windshield by land use, or cultural geography. Living in the West, land has become more than a site for art, more than a landscape to admire. It's a place, a collaboration between people and nature. This is by Will Wilson, who's also Dene. It's Autoimmune Response, which is a series he did about pollution in the Navajo Nation. I still respect much of the older work, but the better I know the New West, the more my attention is claimed by peripheral vision, by the sideshows, the side of the road shows, life on the land. I've learned a new vocabulary, or perhaps overwritten the old one. Classic American earth art. This is Star Axis by Charles Ross. It's not finished yet, but this is an older version. It's still not quite finished. He's been working on that for almost 30 years. So classic American earth art, for the most part, was deliberately beyond it all. A mostly urban art borrowing the emotional power of extraordinary Western landscapes. Land was a raw material for individual expression, and space was a kind of mat within the frame around the photograph. A pseudo-rural art made from a metropolitan headquarters, earthworks take much of their power from distance. Distance from people, distance from issues, and even places. There were even religious undertones along the lines of 19th century Sublime. Isolated from everyday experience, often in the desert, an iconic spiritual site, most land art is site-specific but not place-specific, superimposed on a place and its inhabitants, rather than collaborating with them. This is the late beloved Rez, our dog, in Sun Tunnels. The best of the classic land artists offer simultaneously a spectacle and an intimate experience, instruments for seeing rather than objects to be seen. I have to admit that my favorite art in the land is not contemporary. Across the Americas, Aboriginal earthworks, geomorphs, and rock art, petroglyphs and pictographs, are found on roadsides and on golf courses and in the most remote deserts, forests, and canyons. This is a mile or so from my house in the Galisteo Basin. And can you even see that? Yes, where contemporary land art demands all the attention like a spoiled child, rock art quietly absorbs us into its place, even when we understand very little about the messages we're getting. Although individual images stand out, they're most compelling in relation to each other and to the place and clues they offer about the cultures that created them. Many of these sites are still utilized ceremonially by the Pueblo peoples. And of course, it's easier to identify with the people who were once stewards of that particular landscape than with today's property owner, who's likely to appear with a rifle and arrest you for trespassing. My dog is illiterate. Hidden evidence of the distant past often surfaces in gravel pits. Blackwater Draw in eastern New Mexico was the site of a major archaeological discovery in the 1920s when a Native American named James Ridgely Whiteman, who remains uncredited throughout with this breakthrough, found the first Clovis point in association with mammoth bones, which brought the human record on the continent back to 13,000 years. It's gone back further by now. He realized the significance of his find and he alerted the Smithsonian, which blew him off. Eventually, archaeologists got the picture because in the early 1930s, the state of New Mexico began to dig gravel there and unearthed masses of huge bones. This time, the archaeologists swarmed to the site. Blackwater Draw, once a watering hole for mammoths and their ilk, and also the site of the oldest well ever found in the New World, became history. Later, it was history in another sense. The post-war highway boom demanded gravel, and the site became one of the largest gravel mines in the state. The past was once again sacrificed to the present, and the spectacular evidence was reburied. What could be salvaged, which was little, is now on the National Register of Historic Places, and a small museum is open to the public. It's banned by local fundamentalists because the earth couldn't possibly be that old. So how's that for a sequence of events that incorporates ironic multicultural, multinational, local, global paradigms? This is Robert Smithson's glue pour, a kind of an early sketch for his bigger asphalt pour. This was in Vancouver in 1970 in the show I did. So pits and ruins epitomize the anti-object stance of some 1960s conceptual artists who decided the world had enough objects in the world, though it didn't keep them from making more. They focused on the appeal of absence rather than presence, the invisible rather than the visible, the horizontal rather than the vertical, ideas rather than commodities, the dematerialized rather than the monumental object, and so forth. It's impossible to talk about gravel in an art context without confronting the monumental presence and now absence of Robert Smithson, who brought to North American attention the notion of the Earth's raw materials as art and the entropic appeal of pits. His first proposed earthwork in 1966 was called Tar Pool and Gravel Pit. This is just a sketch for it. Smithson liked to quote his friend Carl Andre saying, "A thing is a hole in a thing it is not." And in his 1967 tour of the monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, he talked about how full of holes the prosaic Passaic seemed in contrast to solid New York. This is by Michael Lights, a highway in Mesa, Arizona. Gravel and travel are symbiotic. Tourism is the straw grasped by desperate economies, by poor states like New Mexico, and by places abandoned by lumber, mining, and gas oil development. Land art isn't exempt from the touristic impulse. adventurers from back east and abroad forged their way over bumpy dirt roads to see the great monumental earthworks, which have become trophies on the art tourism checklist. Visitor centers are planned for Charles Ross's Star Axis, which you saw earlier, and James Turrell's Rodin Crater. You're not allowed to get to Rodin Crater, so this is a land art of the American West student took this from the window, but it's in there somewhere. Walter de Maria's lightning field already has its own exclusive infrastructure. Land art can simultaneously participate in regional economic development and slyly call attention to the fact that many famous Western landscapes are surviving precisely because of cultural heritage and recreational tourism. However, I've come to the reluctant conclusion that land art is mostly for city people. Land art offers an antidote to an urban landscape, often crammed with art and visual competition, and I couldn't resist putting this one in. This come in now. I may have. Yeah, this is the next one. This is by Patrick Nagatani. It's uranium tailings left by Anaconda on Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. Indians and archaeological sites, the military and the nuclear industries are tourist destinations in New Mexico. Tourism and history are joined at the hip, often bonded by alternative facts. A few decades ago, several of these elements came together in the uranium mines in the pueblos of Acoma and Laguna and in the Navajo Nation, eventually killing off a lot of those picturesque native people, not to mention the fate of wildlife. And I couldn't resist getting these, this picture in which you've probably seen. I had a great-grandfather who had a ranch with a huge gate of buffalo skulls. It's pretty appalling. And then this is by Adrienne Vetter, who works from Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. She's non-native, but she's very involved in the reservation. Taking that picture and with the oil extraction, oil well thing going down underneath it. Not to mention the fate of wildlife, as I said. Grizzlies are long gone in the Southwest. Black bears starving in droughts come down out of the mountains for food and are killed or displaced. In New Mexico and elsewhere, cougars, coyotes, wolves, and even bobcats are fair game. This is by Dory Klein. It's as traditional industries like ranching and mining subside, bowing to the contradictory needs and greeds of contemporary society, abandoned pits and toxic sites like the Rocky Mountain Arsenal outside of Denver become wildlife and bird sanctuaries faster than anyone thought possible. That's where she took this picture. This is partly because so much habitat is being destroyed by urban sprawl and gas and oil extraction that the critters have to settle for what they can get. It's no accident that many young native artists like Rose Bean Simpson from Santa Clara Pueblo, who did this, are into post-apocalyptic imagery. For centuries, native peoples have lived with and resisted the possibility of their world's ending. This is by Merrill McMaster, who's Cree from Canada, a series called In Between Worlds, Human and Nature, who gives tree hugging a kind of profound new meaning. And this title of this painting by Salish artist Lawrence Pollux Willipton speaks for itself. Red man watching white man trying to fix hole in the sky. These artists are not alone, and this deserves another whole lecture, but I wanted to cram it in. I like to think the word gravel is also related to the word grave. Living in what was becoming New York's Soho in the 60s, I watched the Twin Towers go up, and in 2001, over the radio in New Mexico, I heard them come down on their way to becoming the most famous pit in the world. This is Joel Sternfeld's iconic image. Soon it was just a hole in the national psyche that replaced earlier ground zeros. The Trinity site in New Mexico and the craters of the Nevada test site, Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island, which is slated to be an art installation site in part due to the tireless work of Mural and Euclides. It became a cemetery without markers, another flattened erection. Just before his accidental death in 1973, Smithson was trying to get Peabody Coal to fund a reclamation artwork. Years later, I was driving through the Navajo Nation and we invited ourselves into Peabody Coal's domain on Black Mesa, a fenced-off reservation within the reservation. I wanted to photograph the humongous pits and machinery that echo other industrial sites dotting the Navajo Nation. Peabody supplied energy primarily to Las Vegas, a Nevada desert gambling town that now has a population of 1.5 million and counting. I was about to take the picture when I was stopped by a drive-by Peabody security officer who was Navajo. She said, "No photographs." This is by Chip Thomas, who is an African-American doctor who's worked in the Navajo Nation for 25 years under the name of Jet Sonorama. He does rural street art. This is called "Burning Fossil Fuels is a Dark Cloud Over Future Generations." This is a huge thing on the side of an adobe ruin. And I couldn't resist putting that in too, so it's an ad. So anyway, this Navajo security officer said, "No photographs." No photographs is a common and historically justified admonition on Indian lands, especially at sacred sites and during seasonal ceremonial dances. In some of the New Mexico pueblos, you can pay to take pictures, but for the most part, they're discouraged. So I'm down with the idea that unpermitted photographs are unacceptable cultural invasions. But Peabody Coal, maybe it was sacred to capitalism. At the same time, the whole beautiful mesa and a lot of the area's very scarce water was disappearing into the pockets of the corporation. Black Mesa itself is a major archaeological site and the location of myriad Navajo and Hopi sacred places. Maybe the Navajo security officer had a double agenda. In Wyoming, the biggest coal-producing state in the U.S., there's an industry-protective state law forbidding anyone's photographs of the blights on the land, even public land, even if the photographer isn't trespassing, you're just standing by the side of the road. You can be arrested for taking these pictures for fear the images will be used, God forbid, for environmentalist causes. This is a Wyoming coal train by the Center for Land Use Interpretation. I'm increasingly interested in what I call critical landscape photography, another whole lecture, because it works in the gap between art and life where I like to hang out. Despite its mountains, the horizontal is iconic in the landscape of the American West, not just the plains, but the sprawl, the journeys, highway and the railway that lead to growing cities, the road that becomes a place in itself, a site of mobility, as J.B. Jackson put it. We're drawn through the landscape on what Chellis Glendinning calls the fingers of imperialism. These gridded lines inform a way of seeing that flattens and blurs the places they run through, like photography, which I think is one reason that photography has grabbed so many contemporary artists, as it's grabbed me too. Landscape photography is often preferred by the apolitical connoisseur since it appears to have no content. Some of the most gorgeous images have been used as propaganda to grease the wheels of manifest destiny or profit-based tourism. But it's also used by environmentalists to save what remains of wilderness. And it can be a unique way of communicating places to those who will never see them firsthand. This is also by Michael Light, who you saw something earlier. It's a mountaintop removal for the Las Vegas residential development. At the same time, many environmentally concerned photographers have struggled with the beauty of ugliness. Wounds on the land, vast strip mines, mountaintop removal, and colorfully toxic waters can be striking and even beautiful. Many believe that beauty can powerfully convey difficult ideas by engaging people when they might otherwise look away. Others accuse these photographers of aestheticizing disaster. Those who choose beauty for this subject matter are most effective when they're also aware of the flip side, when their choice of beauty is a conscious means to counter brutality. This is by Shubhankar Banerjee, who's now actually the head of the Land Arts of the American West program at the University of New Mexico. It's called Known and Unknown. It's tracks in the Arctic tundra, where he has worked for a long time, by oil company vehicles on the wetlands. Supposedly the wetlands were out of bounds to industry, but the Bush administration seems to have ignored that, and so there are these lines across it. Now that we know that they may drill in ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, we have to think about that. Climate change is giving landscape photography a new mission. It can show us where we are, point out devastation of ecosystems that we may have ignored, leading to remediation. Some photographers, like Shubhankar Banerjee in his Arctic work, who declare themselves activists first and artists second, aren't challenging the medium of photography so much as they're dealing with political land use issues. Individual style isn't their concern, and it can be difficult to tell their works apart. This emphasis on content over individual style is central to the work of the Center for Land Use Interpretation, based in Southern California. A significant innovator in landscape photography, it's a unique blend of art and geography, disingenuously apolitical, dedicated to, quote, the increase in diffusion of information about how the world's lands are appropriated, utilized, and perceived. Artists' names usually aren't attached to the very factual photographs. The sly blandness with which Kluwe presents its images belies the hard information they offer about loaded environmental issues. Their work, as my partner once put it, trumps cynicism. In 2003, Kluwe mounted Margins in Our Mist, an exhibition about gravel, the material that makes up the ground we live on, they said. They conducted a tour of the pits in the Los Angeles suburb of Irwindale, the largest aggregate mining area in the state, if not the nation. It's, quote, so full of holes that more of the land in the city is a pit than not, and boasts some of the most banal and dramatic landscapes in Los Angeles. By the time we are done, warned Kluwe, we probably won't be able to tell the difference. Spikulietsanajani was Dene. In the American West, it's been said nature is politics and politics is nature. They're constant collisions of incompatible land uses, indigenous sacred sites, protected public lands, and resource extraction. Given the fact that Native peoples inhabited the entire continent for millennia and that oral traditions produce very long memories, it's not surprising that ancient and contemporary sites, sacred sites, are ubiquitous in virtually every state in the Union and every province in Canada. Nor is it surprising that ignorant white people dismiss indigenous claims everywhere to apparently undistinguished natural features, migration paths, often almost invisible shrines, and places where medicinal plants are gathered or where legendary events took place. This is by Kapolani Landgraf, who is Hawaiian. It's a site, an ancient Hawaiian site that was mined for sand. Native sacred sites are significantly often embedded in or embodied by nature herself. The fundamental issue here is that we colonials are hard put to understand the sanctity of unimproved pieces of earth. The intricate connections between mountains, springs, and lakes and Native American religious culture are evident all over the West. Canadian First Nations, and now our First Nations, have been protesting tar sands exploitation since 1966, and it's been proved to be poisoning the air in their communities. A group called Idle No More pioneered the recent protests against the dirty crude, and other Native groups have sprung up, many of which are led by elder women. Yes, I'm going to talk about Standing Rock. In New Mexico, one of the major struggles is about the recent federal decision to permit oil and gas drilling around the fascinating Chaco Canyon National Historical Park in New Mexico, which will destroy irreplaceable archaeological sites beyond the park's boundaries, ruin the viewsheds, and discourage tourists. This is a map of the spills that have happened around the Chaco area from fossil fuel extraction, mostly fracking. Chaco is close to my heart. I first camped there in 1972, revisited almost yearly, and co-authored a book on it. And another battle, which I'm sure you've seen, Gold King, the horrendous leak from an abandoned Colorado mine, caused ironically by workers for the EPA, although the real blame belongs to the corporations that mined their profits and walked off, leaving such dangerous conditions. And there, as you know, there are thousands of them all over the West, and certainly in Montana. There needs to be a ban on mining in watersheds. Gold King is only one of the thousands of potential Superfund sites that's been disastrous for farmers, especially Navajo farmers downstream in New Mexico who aren't being compensated. The Yellow River looks like it might be a Cristo, even looks like art. Artist Drew Lenehan from Santa Fe combined photographic context with artifacts dipped in water from the Animus for this installation. These are members of the Cowboys and Indians Alliance in Nebraska. I recently read that every year taxpayers across the western states are missing out on more than $1 billion in revenues thanks to coal companies operating on public lands that are taking advantage of loopholes and subsidies, allowing them to extract coal at a fraction of the cost they pay on private lands. Environmental and often ranchers groups, and often ranchers too, are looking for a common sense rule that would require industry to pay for their fair share when they mine coal or anything else on our public lands. At the same time, privatization is becoming a major threat to access to public lands and resources, and of course you Montanans are obviously in the thick of this, having provided us with Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. Well known as a dirty energy advocate, but also an opponent of selling off public lands, supposedly. I'm waiting in terror to see what comes of his current review of some 54 national monuments, including the Organ Mountains and Rio Grande del Norte monuments in New Mexico. This is from Bears Ears, the last week's decision to chop up the Bears Ears, recent monumentalized Bears Ears in Utah, is devastating for the 5 tribes that instigated monument status, and for anybody who cares about magnificent landscapes, ecological havens, and all the archaeological sites being looted and destroyed. I hope those of you who are as passionate about protecting these lands as I am are out there letting him know how crucial these places are to what this country supposedly stands for. This is by Robert Dawson. It's a reservoir in Rye Patch, Nevada. The American West, of course, has a drinking problem, as Pete Roca put it. Water is a huge subject that leaks into almost every crack in Undermining. They're predicting that by 2030, only 60% of the world's water needs will be met. A new study reports that the Colorado River, where my water comes from, has lost nearly 20% of its volume since 2000, partly due to drought, partly to climate change. 40 million people in 2 countries, US and Mexico, and 7 states, including New Mexico, depend on that water. A sci-fi situation, no longer fiction, is pending. One of the many outrages is the court's approvals of Nestle's pumping millions of gallons of water from the San Bernardino National Forest with a permit that expired 28 years ago. I love this quote from Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince. "What makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere it hides a well." But thoughtless growth has made the sight of those water holes a depressing sign. Massive ongoing droughts and fire seasons in the West, exacerbated by the threats from the mining and fossil fuel industries threatening watersheds, are really terrifying. This is by Canupa Lugar, who was raised on Standing Rock. He calls it poetic armor. It's mirror shields. In Washington State, the Lummi Nation's recent, I think actually there was another slide. Yes, sorry, that comes first. In Washington State, the Lummi Nation's recent victory over Big Coal in the coal export terminal case was a very rare moment when the U.S. for once honored its treaty obligations, or what a native cartoonist in New Mexico calls tweety obligations. Now, of course, the script has changed. Standing Rock on the Sioux Reservation in Sioux Nation in North Dakota is only the latest example of Native nations fighting back. But its scale was really unique. I'm sure you all know this. A gathering of more than 200 U.S. recognized nations protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline under the Missouri River, protecting sacred sites, and above all, water. And this is Canupa Lugar's piece. He was, as I said, raised on Standing Rock. These people are water protectors, not protesters. The distinction is really significant. The media has made much too little of the fact that indigenous people were protecting not only their own waters and sacred sites, but those of millions of non-natives downstream the Missouri River, many of whom voted for Trump. And of course, he immediately approved DAPL, and a leak has already occurred. But this week, a judge, which you probably heard again, decided that the environmental impact survey was inadequate. So that's considered a victory for Standing Rock for the nations, but who knows what's coming next. Now that Standing Rock resistance has been curtailed, The struggle is shifting to other sites like the Trans-Pecos pipeline near the Rio Grande in Texas, and DAPL's last stop, the Bayou Bridge pipeline in Louisiana, the state that has suffered already 144 pipeline accidents in 2016, where another pipeline exploded this February. The water protectors movement is already showing signs of moving to Fort Peck, where the Sioux and Assiniboine are protesting newly reapproved Keystone Pipeline stuff, another black snake that will weave its way through eastern Montana past several native reservations and under 56 rivers, including the Missouri and the Yellowstone, as well as under the Oglala Aquifer. According to an Obama administration State Department report, the Keystone Pipeline would disturb more than 15,000 acres, 10% of that on public lands. It would cross 265 archaeological sites and 132 historic structures, 44 of which are eligible for National Historic Register of Historic Places, and pose a risk to more than 2,500 water wells, soils, wildlife, and vegetation. I get carried away with these statistics. They really... This you recognize as the Grand Canyon, a Stephen Yelverton photograph. In 2015, more than 305 million people visited our drastically underfunded national parks, spending nearly $16 billion on an array of local services and helping to sustain nearly 300,000 jobs. That's far more than those touted for the short-term construction of the Keystone Pipeline, which are in turn way short of the 28,000 jobs that Trump has touted. After construction, only some 35 actual positions would be in place. This is the amount of income that comes from public lands in the West. Pretty but depressing. Canadian artist Peter von Tiesenhausen came up with a great strategy when he blocked a pipeline in Demet, Alberta by copywriting his land as artwork and building 8 feet of a picket fence annually as a lifetime project. He also charges $500 for, quote, assholes from oil companies to try to talk to him, though the answer is always no. Here are a couple of other artworks along those pipelines. In 1986, Nancy Holt made an indoor-outdoor piece called Pipeline in Anchorage, Alaska, a comment on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. That's the indoor part, and that's the outdoor part. In 2016, Alex Luboff made a carefully crafted wooden pipeline described as a metaphorical obstruction representing the immense government and private investments that support fossil-based fuel energy at the expense of directing resources towards other less ecologically damaging solutions. And here's the real thing. There are 2.5 million miles of pipelines in the US alone, and we're way out in front of oil consumption in the world. Despite claims that pipelines are touted as the safest way to transport hazardous materials, there have been over 3,300 incidents with crude oil and gas pipelines, 80 killed, 389 injured, these are people. And these figures, I think, are about a year out of date. They're aging pipelines everywhere, and very few inspections, endangering water and therefore a percentage of our food supply. This is the map of crude oil spills from US pipelines from 2010 to the present. These accidents directly and indirectly impact all of us. It's been acknowledged that transporting oil via pipelines is generally safer than rail or truck or barge, as I said, yet pipeline spills are constantly occurring. Since 1995, accidents involving oil and petroleum pipelines in the US have caused approximately $3 billion worth of damage, property damage. This is by Debbie Fleming Caffery in the Gulf of Mexico. 5 years after the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, tourism hadn't recovered, not to mention the Gulf itself and its flora and fauna. Harder to gauge is the trauma caused to people and their sense of place. In 2008, when we fought fracking in the Galisteo Basin, where I live, I didn't realize it would soon be a continental battle. This, what looks like a wonderful abstract painting, is a photograph, aerial photograph by Louis Helbig of residual bitumen at Alberta tar sands. When tar sands excavation began to devastate Alberta and the back and boom transformed North Dakota, I didn't realize that the deadly tar sands were also headed by rail into Maine, one of my home states, for export, or that the entire nation would be drawn into the battle against fracking, now proved to be disastrous for water, air quality, and even causing earthquakes, another subject too vast to take on tonight. But I like this comment by Aviva Romani about oil, water, and money. And I can't resist adding one more. Totally un-West related issue that's literally heating up, partly because the art is impressive. While coral reefs cover only 0.0025% of the oceanic floor, they absorb nearly 1/3 of the carbon dioxide generated from burning fossil fuels. Who knew? And we've lost nearly half of the Earth's coral thanks to ocean warming. These are Jason DeCaris's underwater sculptures. They're living down there among other life forms. And this is Mar-a-Lago underwater. Whoops, was. If all these seductive statistics don't scare you enough, there's one more ally in the burgeoning climate change process that's even less controllable than the deniers, nature herself. One example, from 2012 to 2014, the state of Alaska emitted the equivalent of 22 million tons of carbon dioxide gas into the atmosphere from biological sources, the melting of the frozen tundra. This is comparable to all the emissions from the US commercial sector in a year. In other words, nature is competing with or collaborating with humans in an apocalyptic future. Historian Tim LeCain provocatively argues that calling our era the Anthropocene is indeed anthropocentric, preserving our habit of crediting humans either as the failed stewards of our Eden or the technological heroes who can geoengineer our planet into a more reliably hospitable state. He attributes equal agency to such players as coal, methane, and oil, nature's bad boys. Artists often get involved in these issues even when they don't see themselves as activists. British artist Chris Drury's sculpture, pointedly titled Carbon Sink, What Goes Around Comes Around, was constructed of beetle-killed trees and installed on the campus of the University of Wyoming in 2011. At the center of the vortex is a pile of coal. To make a long story short, the sculpture was deinstalled long before its scheduled demise because conservative Wyoming has a very short fuse when it comes to coal. This is the Wyoming State House mural, kind of tells it like it is. The director of the Wyoming Mining Association took the arts message personally, unfurling veiled threats to funding for the arts. All of this recalls a recent New Mexico kerfuffle when the newly elected Republican land commissioner got rid of brick-face hope by sculptor James Tyler outside his building and replaced it with a pump jack, more symbolic than he may have realized. So much for hope. Eudora Welty once wrote that one place understood helps us understand all places better. For years I've been preaching the importance of the local, taking responsibility for the place you find yourself and understanding its social ecology, the connections between everything existing there, including human inhabitants. I'm constantly reminded how global my beloved local really is. Nearby, this is an old billboard, but it was there for years, are the highway down which trucks carry transuranic waste from Los Alamos and elsewhere to the waste-intensive pilot plant in Carlsbad, WIP, a pit that receives rather than gives, a geological lockbox for chemical sludge and lab gear and filters laced with radioactive plutonium, the detritus of nuclear weapons production. Waste drums of this stuff, and maybe worse, is buried almost a half-mile underground at WIP, in salt beds supposedly secure for 19,000 years. This is a photograph by Juan Rios. But surprise, in 2015, there was one of those accidents and the place was closed down for 2 years and only just now reopened under very suspect analysis. Then we have Los Alamos and the Trinity site at the White Sands Missile Range where the first atom bomb was detonated. There's no escaping these things wherever you are. In New York, I once lived a few blocks from Canal and Broadway, a site once chosen by experts as the most efficient target in the metropolitan area for a nuclear strike. Klaus Oldenburg once proposed a monument for the spot. And nothing is more local than ecology, and nothing is more global than a militarized world fueled by greed and disregard for the land itself. This is called Reframing Eden. It's a series by Beverly Natus on Vashon Island in Washington State. It's photomontages and stories that she uses in community organizing. While specificity and local knowledge provide a base for following the vortex of land and lives, an exciting liminal space is opened up between disciplines, between the arts, photography, geography, history, archaeology, sociology, and the sciences, of course. If the heyday of and funding for huge artworks is largely in the past, restoration projects still make a lot of sense. And here's a real and valuable function and work for artists who think big. This is work by M12, it's a Boulder-based collective that focuses on rural communities. And in here, there's some of the participants were doing a dirge for a closed mine. All over the West are unsightly gravel pits and slag heaps and mine shafts and overgrazed pastures and trampled riparian areas, piles of hazardous waste leaking into our drinking water systems, all begging for imaginative remediation. Artists and architects and landscape architects working together have come up with some innovative notions about what to do with the world's accumulating brownfields. This is by Patricia Johansson. It's Ellis Creek Recycling Facility in Petaluma, California, a gigantic project. She magnifies images of living organisms, and this was a reclamation project of a sewer area. So it's morning glory and salt marsh mouse, which are a little hard to see in this. The difference between the earthworks of 40 years ago and more recent restorative or prescriptive eco-art is not only ecological consciousness gained in the intervening decades, it's also a broader sense of the world beyond the site. Art can't change the world alone, especially at this moment when it seems nothing can. But artists can be worthy allies to those challenging power with unconventional solutions. This is a group called Liberate Tate about the British Petroleum funding of British museums. The Tate got out of that funding, and now they're attacking the Portrait Gallery, the National Portrait Museum. Artists are good at provoking questions, slipping between the institutional walls to expose the layers of emotional and aesthetic resonance in our relationships to place, to the history of production buried in the land. Sometimes they're also brave enough to fight power, like here. This is a protest at the Louvre in Paris. Eco-art often invades natural and infrastructural systems to maintain or rehabilitate them. Without resorting to the quaint and the retrograde, contemporary artists and collectives all over the world are demonstrating that they can think micro as well as macro, local as well as global. All such products and funding for any art at all are threatened by the present administration. The oil industry has even tried to get into our act with an ad that claims oil gushes art. Petroleum makes the things that make us creative. Give me a break. No, this is not. You have to have a delicate head. This is called Draining the Swamp. And it's by a group that's putting things up on walls and stuff in Taos, New Mexico. As I work on local water and land issues, my mantra has become long-term thinking is in short supply. There's a point where artists, like everyone else, have to take some responsibility for the places they love, a point at which the colonization of magnificent scenery gives way to a more painfully focused vision of a fragile landscape and its bewildered inhabitants. But dire warnings for the distant future don't go over well in the US, even since 9/11, and especially now. This is just a Victorian thing I couldn't resist sticking in. We Americans are often immune to long-term thinking, very reluctant to give up our vaunted quality of life, even as we watch it crumble before our very eyes, as money goes to war and tax cuts for the rich, instead of to social services and confronting the enormous cloud of climate change. It's not fear-mongering to say, get off the tracks, a train is coming. The US, with 5% of the world's population, uses 20% of the resources. Our way of life is endangering everyone, and our government seems powerless to stand up to the powers that are taking us down. The rush to access all the remaining 2/3 of the Earth's fossil fuels before the tipping point in 2050, and before we come to our senses, is pretty terrifying. Saying no to big oil and big coal and big everything else is apparently beyond us. The real problem, to oversimplify, is capitalism, based on endless growth now impossible to sustain. This is by Oliver Ressler, who's an Austrian artist. As Slavoj Zizek or Frederick Jameson, that seems to be contested, has wryly commented, it's easier to conceive of the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And we have to wonder with Charles Bowden, why can't we imagine a future where we have less but are more? As I said at the very end of Undermining, the book documents only fragments of a moment in time. Almost every case study I used there and here in this talk could be replaced by dozens of others as the narrative races on. Every issue is in flux, every outcome is a cliffhanger. If there's a point to it all, it's to urge you to stay abreast of these issues and to make art about them. Buckminster Fuller famously declared, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. A lot easier said than done. Nature writer Rick Bass once suggested that the activist is the artist's ashes, emerging from the pure into the impure. I prefer to think of artists as arising not from as phoenixes arising not from the ashes of their own aspirations, but from the ashes of obsolete definitions of art. And that's what inspired these ramblings. This is Jeremy Deller's flag for the Creative Times Flag Day Pledge of Allegiance project. Flag Day is Trump's birthday. Anyway, I'd love to have a discussion if we've still got time. I don't have answers, but I enjoy hearing what you all have to say. I guess, can I? And I'm willing to wait. I suspect that some of you in the audience know more about these issues than I do. I tend to sort of cut and paste when I see things. Reading this out loud, I realize, because I rewrite this for every venue, it's awfully heavy on statistics, isn't it? But they're so overwhelming, I can't ever get over them. Yeah.
So I heard maybe yesterday or the day before, and I don't know if this is true or not, but Nestle is apparently going under like this entire company.
Is Nestle is what?
Nestle is apparently going under.
Oh,
Is that true?
under how far?
Like they're going out. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, the trouble is what usually happens if one person goes out, they're either being bought out by somebody else who's bigger, or somebody else is taking over the destruction. But it's always nice to see one of these guys go. What are the issues in Montana that are particularly driving you all nuts?
Smith River Mine.
What?
The Smith River Mine.
The which river mine? I'm sorry.
Smith River Mine. It's actually a mine over by the Smith River.
And are artists organizing around this at all?
Not that I know of. It's mainly been political groups.
It's not always easy for artists to infiltrate sort of political groups. I've done a lot of work for years with artists, and A, it's like herding cats because people want to get back to the studio, and B, the political groups don't have the respect for the art. They didn't used to. I haven't done anything with big groups recently, but I know one time we were doing, I was very involved in Central America work in the early 80s, and we were doing this huge Washington March, and we worked and worked and worked to make this giant, I can't believe I ate it all, what was his name, it was some advertisement and so forth. I mean, we did a lot of work, and it was really some good stuff for this march. And at the last minute, everybody was late, and so they said, well, we'll just cut the art and poetry out. And we just said no, you know. But it was a fight, and it was a person we all knew who was running it, but she thought, well, if we have to get rid of something, we'll get rid of the art. And so it's up to us as art workers to change that kind of view. And I think the things they've done at the Tate about BP were very effective. That curled up, oiled soaked person was only one of many things that they've done. So go for that. It was something we're, yeah, go ahead.
In that regard, are there other examples of contemporary art images or objects that have been successful to inspire change and can be traced to that? And if so, like what is, in your opinion, the correct strategy for artists to approach an issue?
That's the question. What is the correct strategy for artists and what has been effective? I don't, it's very hard to tell, for one thing, what's been effective. I mean, because hopefully artists are working with other groups. I can't think of any single artwork that just changed the world, whammo. But I've been, and right now it's so overwhelming to figure out what to do. I've been meeting with several neighbors in the tiny village I live in, and we've been trying to figure, okay, what's effective? We're not going to do the comb over, the tiny hands, the Cheeto tan, and so forth. We want to deal with policy and what would be effective, and we don't want to preach to the choir. I mean, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir right now. So how do we get out of the choir? And one thing we've done is one of my neighbors has put together these little cards, that just little V-shaped cards that you can leave on shelves, and we leave them around in stores and places, and it says, do we know that such and such, and how much, like Trump's Mar-a-Lago trips are costing the taxpayer, but there are a lot of other subjects, and immigration, because we live in New Mexico, is particularly important to an awful lot of people there, so some of these little cards have, my stuff is, and I've done this off and on for years, is little stickers, I call it stick 'em up, with cartoon balloons and with just one-liners about, do we know such, and just one line. His things are much more informative. But I put them in the back of women's toilet stalls and so forth, where you're stuck looking at them. And so anyway, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the strategy is. And I think you really have to work locally on that and work with your own people and see what comes up. I don't think there's one strategy that could possibly work. I wish I knew. Yeah.
Who do you think are the 2 or 3 or 4 most effective organizations fighting fossil fuels and advocating for renewable energy?
I wish I knew. What are the 3 or 4 most effective organizations fighting fossil fuels for renewable energy? I live off the grid, so I can be very smug about that. But no, I just don't. I just don't know. I mean, I think we all have to just put the money where we do, if we possibly have any extra money, put it into the one that we know best is doing something in locally. I'm very big, as you can tell, on this working locally and looking at what effects certain groups have had locally rather than reading national stuff about them and so on. Like this mine, is anybody who's working on that? Are they effective? Are they worth supporting? And would they like some art? Anybody else? Oh, sorry, Becca.
I'm curious if there's any groups that help artists connect.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to hear you.
I'm curious if there's any existing groups that help artists infiltrate policy or enact environmental restoration. Because obviously our skill sets can only be so broad, so there has to be elements of collaboration with people in different fields. Do you know of any groups that help connect artists outside of the field of art that you advocate for?
I know artist groups like Creative Time, which did this Pledge of Allegiance flag project and so on, that encourage and support artists doing that kind of thing. I don't know any non-art groups that are supporting artists. I mean, there may be. I mean, I'd love to know about them if you know. Anybody know of any? Creative Capital gives grants to people who are doing, effective things. I mean, there are a lot of artists grant things now that they're actually listening to artists doing this kind of work, which back in the day was not the case. I mean, forget applying for a grant to bitch about the government. But now I think things are actually at a point where you may be able to get some money for that kind of thing if it isn't too pointed, too good, too obvious. Whatever. I wish I did know. And then you can try to, rev it up in your own community and try to talk to these groups and say, hey, what about some money for doing this? And billboards, handouts, all kinds of little things to joggle people's. I don't frankly think there's much hope to change the Trumpian base, but there have to be disintegrating fringes now and then if he gets rid of Medicare and Social Security and ruins the national parks and so forth. There has to be some people who will be crumbling there. And consciousness raising is something that art really can do if you can do it in an interesting way. I mean, a weird picture that doesn't seem to be about the subject and then suddenly you realize it is, like these little cards we put around and stuff. I mean, I think there are all kinds of ways you can joggle people who may be trying to think more about things. Who knows? Yeah, way back.
Yeah, I wanted to know, you said that you'd love to know about organizations that kind of are a fusion of art, engineering, law, environmental concepts. Do you have any awareness of Stuart Brand, the older catalog?
Sure, I'm from that generation.
Yeah. And so what I love about that generation is, a lot of times it seems like art gets separated out as its own thing, and then the lawyers or the advocates are separate. What I love about that generation and that community is their full spectrum integration of everyone in the community and all the skills that everyone has. So people are looking for, kind of a touch point about how to use and how to work together. I think that they're a wonderful community and really great. Lockdown Foundations, Stuart Brand, older catalog.
Well, again, I don't know of anybody who's doing Stuart Brand at the moment, although he's still kicking. He's still out there talking about things. Here again, I'm just going to ask you, it's not like I know what to do or anything. You should be working with the people you're working with and sitting down and really seeing what matters to the people you know best. I mean, you may have the proverbial Uncle Joe who is very much in disagreement with everything you stand for. Can you sit down with him? Can you find out where the root of that is, what he's really pissed off about, and try to deal with that? I don't know. Yeah, Mary.
Hi, Lucy, and thank you always. The things you asked about is our situation here in Montana. And one of the things that I've noticed in the American West, in particular in Montana, is that we are sort of the playground for some of the, I'm going to call it industrial money. That Montana becomes the second home, the third home, the place where we entertain, some of this money that's tied up in some of these efforts to, buy our private lands, to develop them for particular resources. And I think as artists, we simply need to be aware of that, especially in Missoula. Is the money that's supporting your exhibition dirty money? Period.
Right, yeah.
What you do. And I think I look at particular art centers in Montana that have come to be in the last few years. Where did that money come from and what are they presenting to us? And is that what we want? Is that what we think is appropriate for this place?
Absolutely, yes. And that's where the local activism is really important, or just teaching your classes, as I know you do. I mean, and seeing what comes out of it. Yeah.
Well, I was impressed with the man in Canada who put the fence up and called it art.
Yeah.
And I just think that subversion of what we call art, whether that would be a good thing to bring to our minds so that we can question a lot of things and say, is that art, or call things art that we don't traditionally call art. And I'm thinking of one of our bicycle guys in town who would never call himself an artist, but I call him an artist now after reading your book. And then also, just questioning what could be art, otherwise we'll stay in our little art box.
Mm-hmm. Well, I totally, as I said at the end, but we have to redefine what art is. But we've been trying to do that. I started doing this stuff in the 60s, and we've been trying to do that ever since. And it has spread. I mean, there really is a completely different definition of art than there was in the late 1950s when I got out of college. But it's, you know, it needs, everything needs more. I mean, it certainly isn't satisfactory yet, but that's very important. And just say, you know, just if you can, I'm sure there are places in Missoula that I even know about and I can't think about at the moment, but if there's something in the street that you think, oh, wow, what's that? It's pretty, but it's kind of provocative, or it's making me think about something. And it could be art and it could be not art, but who cares what art is? I mean, when it comes down to it, the definition of art for me is just totally uninteresting. Everything that, and they always say, you know, whatever an artist does is art. Okay, I'm up for that. And then some guy steps up and he says, well, so I'm a cyclist, but I'm calling myself an artist because I did this thing. And that's fine. I'd love to see that happen. I'd love to see more people incorporate art into their own lives and their own activities. So spread the word, have a button that says, yeah, I'm an artist or something. It would give art a lot more clout.
Let's do one more question and then we'll close.
Yeah.
So, assuming that art reflects 360 degrees and the human condition and viewpoint, can you think of artists in our modern world that make you worry and
That make what?
make you worry and be angry? Artists of the other viewpoint, I guess.
Yeah. It's interesting how few artists really are of the other viewpoint. I know or who are willing to admit it. There may be plenty of people out there, but they're not getting out in public and bragging about it. But it's interesting, when we were against the Vietnam War, there were artists who, Clement Greenberg, some of his pals were for the Vietnam War. And we were just stunned and we didn't quite know what to do about it, and I still don't.
That's a good example. Or even an example of art being funded by dirty money. It's a really reflective question.
Yeah. And what isn't funded by dirty money? I was just telling somebody back when I would change my bank account such as it was, every time, you know, the bank invested in South Africa or something. And then I'd change it to the next one because they'd be doing something awful. And now there are all these banks that are supporting the Dakota Access Pipeline. And there's a whole campaign asking people to get your money out of those banks. And it's half the banks around, you know, you're probably, and I did have a friend of mine's money for which I'm responsible in Wells Fargo, which is a horror. I mean, it was cast like that. So who knows? I mean, it's really hard to keep up with. One of the things we have to really think about is the level of energy we put into this.